Hello, podheads, and welcome back to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. I am your host for today, Kate Carter,
And I'm Kylie Colwell.
and we are down one. I almost said down for the count, but we are down for the count, but we are also minus one today. Holly is living her best life.
In Hawaii. We're not
Hawaii,
jealous.
not at all, not one bit. Us Floridians. Holly, if you're listening to this, you missed a good episode. Okay. So I've got a good long story for you all today, starting with a good long intro. So let's get started. The woman sitting inside the Matawan State Hospital for the criminally insane had already cheated death once. Years earlier, a judge had sentenced her to die in the electric chair, making her the first woman in American history ever condemned to execution by electrocution. Newspapers across the country had printed her name. People argued over whether she was evil or insane. Some people believed she was one of the most dangerous women America had ever seen. Others thought she was so mentally ill that she had no understanding of the crimes she had committed. But one thing everyone seemed to agree on was this: if Lizzie Halliday had remained free, people would continue to die. So when she was transferred to Matawan instead of being executed, most people assumed the danger had finally passed, but they were wrong. Because on February 28th, 1906, Lizzie Halliday attacked a nurse named Nellie Wicks with a pair of scissors. Witnesses later said Lizzie stabbed the nurse over and over again, inflicting wounds so severe that Nellie died shortly afterwards. Even inside a secure institution designed specifically to house people considered too dangerous or mentally unstable to exist in society, Lizzie had managed to kill again. And honestly, if that was the only thing Lizzie was known for, we'd probably still be talking about her today. But somehow it wasn't. Because by the time nurse Nellie Wicks died, Lizzie Halliday had already left behind a trail of suspicious deaths, multiple marriages, allegations of poisoning, an arson conviction, hidden graves, and one of the most shocking murder investigations of the 19th century. And yet, most people know to this day have never heard of her. Everybody knows a woman named Lizzie Borden, but no one knows Lizzie Halliday. Before she was Lizzie Halliday, though, she was known as Eliza Margaret McNally. Even that part, to be honest, this whole story will get not confusing, but this is the oldest story I've ever done. And so when you do old stories, there's not a lot of information out there. Or if it is, it's very vague. So some things aren't really straightforward. So I tried to do my best on it. But one thing you'll notice throughout this entire story is that Lizzie had a habit of changing names. She changed her identity multiple times. She loved to reinvent herself. And this was pretty much anytime something like stopped going her way. If you start researching this case, you'll come across different versions of her name. Don't worry. It's not, very normal. She just had an unfortunate talent for making it incredibly difficult to pin down exactly who she was, which I think is kind of the point. So, most historians believe that Lizzie was born around 1859, and she was born in County Atrium in Ireland. But the details of Lizzie's childhood are very few and far in between because when you're dealing with someone in the 1890s, birth records weren't always preserved, immigration records aren't perfect, and people weren't anticipating, really that this little girl would someday become a notorious woman in America. At some point during her childhood, Lizzie immigrated to the US with her family. And this is where things get a little interesting because, unlike a lot of the stories and cases that we cover, this wasn't some like big traumatic childhood, event that led Lizzie to become who she became. There's no well documented history of any abuse against Lizzie growing up. There's no major like head injury or brain injury that she had, that changed her personality. There's not really a single moment where historians collectively like said, yes, this is where it all started. Instead, Lizzie just kind of appears in historical records already with chaos around her. So we don't know her name without her background. Her first major view that we get into her life comes through marriage or marriages. In 1870, Lizzie married a man named Charles Hopkins, but Charles, this doesn't make any sense to me. Charles's real name was not Charles Hopkins, it was Ketspol Brown.
I
K,
think I like Charles better.
yeah, Ketspol, Ketspol, which I feel like you can't say without a British accent, but Kettsville Brown, aka Charles Hopkins, don't know how that happened. Sounds like a fake name. But in their marriage, the two of them, they had a son together, and then out of nowhere, Daddy Charles dies. At the time, his death wasn't really treated as suspicious. Nobody arrested Lizzie, she wasn't charged. I mean, life expectancy in the 19th century wasn't really fantastic. People died from illnesses and infections all the time. But years later, after investigators began looking back through Lizzie's life, Daddy Charles's death started attracting attention. And it wasn't the last time that one of Lizzie's husbands died under suspicious circumstances. After Charles died, Lizzie remarried pretty quickly. Her second husband was a much older man named Artemus Brewer, which is a great name. And just like Charles, he went on to die. But there was no murder conviction, and again, authorities had no evidence against Lizzie saying that she did anything wrong. But if you're listening to the story or haven't heard the story before, and this is your first time hearing it, you've probably already having the same reaction that investigators do, because twice might be a coincidence, maybe. But once you start adding up all the other details together, it becomes harder and harder to ignore. Lizzie remarried again, and this time to a man, she's on her third husband, to a man named Hiram Parkinson. Interesting enough, though, Hiram actually survived. The marriage itself did not. The two eventually separated, and Lizzie moved on with her life. This is another pattern that we're going to see over and over again throughout her life, because when things just stopped benefiting Lizzie, she would just pack up and leave. Sometimes she physically relocated, sometimes she changed her name, sometimes she found another husband, sometimes people died. But eventually, Lizzie became involved with another man named George Smith. And according to later reports, Lizzie attempted to poison George Smith with arsenic. That's just an allegation, but we do know that Lizzie packed up and left after this allegation came about. And George did not die, so, 2 out of 4. But what we do know is that she packed up and left and was good at starting over. But I also have to say this, in the 1800s, it's not that hard to start over because there's no computers, no databases, no social media, there's no way to pull up someone's background or history. So if you move to a town under a different name, there's a really good chance nobody was going to ever know who you were before that. And that's something that Lizzie took full advantage of. At different points in her life, Lizzie, that we know of, went by Lizzie Halliday, Eliza McNally, Maggie Hopkins, and other aliases. Could have been going by the name Alice, who knows? But with each identity, she had this opportunity to escape whatever trouble she could have been in. But eventually, she did make a mistake. It was in Philadelphia that Lizzie became involved in a business venture that ended badly. Instead of accepting the loss of the business, the building just mysteriously caught fire one day. Authorities believed Lizzie had intentionally set the fire in order to collect insurance money. And unlike many of the suspicious deaths associated with her, this crime actually ended up in consequences. Lizzie was convicted of arson and she was sent to prison. And honestly, this conviction was pretty important because it shows us something, which I won't say, but it will show us something that will come back later in Lizzie's life that you're like, this makes sense. So she was willing to lie, she was willing to manipulate situations, and she had absolutely no problem reinventing herself afterwards. So once Lizzie was released from prison, she eventually found her way to a place called Sullivan County, and it's in New York. And that's where she met a man named Paul Halliday. He was 70 years old, so much older, and a widower. At first glance, Paul probably seems like the exact kind of person Lizzie had spent years attaching herself to. Paul was older, he owned property, he lived on a farm, and he was alone. Well, okay, he wasn't entirely alone though, because Paul didn't just live by himself. He did share the property with his adult son, John Halliday, who we'll come back to.
So she got herself a little sugar daddy.
She got a little sugar daddy. And we love Paul. Paul was good by all accounts. He would have been dead regardless. It was the 1800s. So when Lizzie moved on to the Halliday farm, Paul had already lived an entire life. He was almost 71 years old. He was a Civil War veteran, and he had spent decades working on his farm in Sullivan County. So, by all accounts, he had experienced his fair share of loss as well, because his first wife had died years earlier, and then much of his later life revolved around maintaining the farm by himself and caring for his son, John. So, life in rural New York in the late 19th century wasn't easy, as you can imagine, especially for a aging farmer. There were fences that constantly needed to be repaired, animals that required feeding regardless of weather conditions or how you were feeling, crops that couldn't wait because someone was tired, and countless daily responsibilities that didn't become any less demanding just because a man had reached older age. So when Lizzie came into his life, she was first a housekeeper and then eventually became his wife. It's entirely possible that Paul genuinely believed he had found, companionship in Lizzie and that she was going to support him during, like the final chapter of his life kind of thing. So, living on the property with Paul and now Lizzie was Paul's son, John. Now, John was very intellectually disabled, which meant that he depended heavily upon the people around him for care and supervision on a daily basis. And it's important to remember that the reality of life for individuals with developmental disabilities during the 1800s definitely looked different than it did today. There were no services available to families. There was very little understanding of mentally handicapped people in general, no protections, kind of, all the normal stuff. So, family members would almost always be lifelong caregivers, or they would be put in some type of institution, which we've talked about before. There just weren't really any other options. So, John was vulnerable in many ways, and that made him particularly dependent upon the people around him, which unfortunately, as we're going to see throughout this case, vulnerable people have a tendency to suffer when Lizzie Halliday is around them. So, neighbors would describe later on Lizzie as being difficult, volatile, and very angry all the time. People remembered her as being argumentative, and others said that they would recall being uneasy around her, but like not being able to explain why. Which, like, when I was writing this, do you ever think about that, like, when you pass away, what people are gonna say about you?
It better be nice things.
Like this, I mean, don't get me wrong, this story is about how horrible Lizzie Halliday is, but difficult, volatile, angry, argumentative, uneasy feeling around people. Honestly, we've all met people that, not naming names, you know who you are, but it's something you can't really name what they've done, but something about them makes you feel uncomfortable. And Lizzie was that kind of person, you avoid trying to be alone with them. You're pretty relieved when they leave a room. And the problem is that, like, hindsight always has this way of, like, telling you things, trust your instinct, trust your gut kind of situation. It's easy to look back after bodies have been discovered and say, like, oh, we knew something was wrong, People often explain away discomfort because, they don't want the alternative. Nobody wants to believe that the evil woman living down the street is capable of murder, Like, you just kind of think, oh, this person makes me uneasy, but it's never like, oh, this person feels like a murderer. Well, now we kind of say that, but in the 1800s, maybe not. Then, in May of 1891, disaster struck on the Halliday farm. A fire ended up breaking out inside of the house. Now, house fires during this period of time were pretty common. Homes were heated using wood burning stoves. They were using oil lamps to illuminate everything, and they were built pretty much from highly flammable materials, so not uncommon. Fire apartments, as we know them today, didn't really exist in many rural communities, and even if they could help and be summoned quickly, there was little, they couldn't do much, once flames had started gaining momentum. So entire families in the 1800s would lose everything in a matter of hours. So when the news spread that the Halliday house had caught fire, people undoubtedly responded with concern, but not really with suspicion. And by the time that the fire had been extinguished, John Halliday was dead, the son. According to Lizzie, though, John had died while trying to save her. So it was a dramatic story, the kind that immediately like invokes sympathy. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that. An intellectually disabled man and son sacrificing himself in an attempt to rescue his stepmom from a burning house. That's like a movie itself, It fits neatly into a narrative of this unfortunate accident. And for a brief period of time, that's exactly how people saw it. But then questions started coming up. And investigators learned, don't know how, but investigators learned that John's bedroom door had been locked. So here's where that story starts shifting from a tragic accident to something potentially unsettling. If John had truly died while attempting to rescue Lizzie, how had he ended up trapped inside of his room? Why was the door locked? Reports from the time suggested that Lizzie actually ended up possessing the key. They found it on her in one of her her pockets or something. So, although exactly what happened inside the house would never be known, investigators did not know that the official explanation, it made no sense. But if John hadn't been able to leave the room because he was locked in there, he couldn't have been running through the house to search for Lizzie. Instead, he would have found himself trapped as the smoke filled the air and flames spread around him, and he was unable to escape no matter how desperately he might have tried. His door was locked. So, despite growing suspicion, authorities lacked enough evidence, though, to pursue murder charges against Lizzie. Fire destroyed all of the evidence they had, and the 19th century forensic science offered very few tools available to what we have now in modern investigations. So John's death remained exactly where Lizzie seemed to prefer things, somewhere between an accident and suspicion. But unfortunately, or fortunately, life on the Halliday farm continued on. At least it appeared to from the outside. As the weeks passed, people began noticing that Daddy, Paul Halliday, wasn't really around anymore, the OG. Neighbors who would normally expect to see him tending to farm work or traveling through town suddenly realized they hadn't seen him in quite some time, actually. But initially, no one panicked. I mean, people traveled, visited friends or family members, and life goes on. But when questions were directed towards Lizzie, her answers were never consistent, which is like red flag 101. Sometimes she claimed that Daddy Paul had gone away temporarily. Other times she suggested that he was handling business, like somewhere else. So the details changed every time she told a story, depending on who was asking. And if you've listened to enough true crime, the red flags go a flying right here. And this is one of my favorite things is innocent people generally have one explanation. Guilty people tend to have several. You like that?
That was really damn good.
I'm gonna say it one more time for the people in the back. Innocent people generally have one explanation. Guilty people tend to have several. So, as Paul's absence stretched from days into weeks, concern throughout the community started to intensify. People who had initially accepted Lizzie's explanations started to get worried. Conversations were starting to be had with neighbors. Paul wasn't a man that was known for disappearing without any explanation. Sure, he was older, but he was he was established in the community. He had lived there his whole life. And he was deeply, and I feel this in my soul, he was deeply connected to his daily routine. So leaving indefinitely without letting anyone know simply just wasn't like who he was. So Daddy Paul's gone. And then another fire happened. In August of 1891, flames broke out inside of a barn located on the Halliday property. At this point, you have to imagine what investigators were thinking. One suspicious fire resulting in the death of son John Halliday might have been written off as like terrible luck. But now there was a second fire connected to the same woman, occurring while her husband had been mysteriously gone for weeks. So, whatever benefit of the doubt Lizzie once had from everybody was kind of now disappearing. Authorities began searching the property extensively, and that's when they made a discovery that transformed the case entirely. Buried beneath the barn floor was a body, and that body belonged to Daddy Paul Halliday. For weeks, while Lizzie had been offering various explanations regarding her husband's whereabouts, Paul's remains had actually been hidden on the property that they all shared together. The old farmer was not away on business. He had not left voluntarily. He had not abandoned his daily farm responsibilities. He had been murdered. Reports regarding Paul's injuries kind of varied somewhat depending on the newspaper source, which, like I've said, it's not unusual. It's the 19th century. But what investigators did agree on, though, is that Paul's death had been violent. He had suffered severe trauma, including devastating injuries to his head that were consistent with repeated blows from a blunt object. Some accounts also referenced evidence suggesting he may have been shot as well. I only saw that in a few articles. So, regardless of the exact sequence of events, one fact pretty much becomes impossible to dispute: his death had not been an accident. For the people of Sullivan County, the realization was awful, as you can imagine. They had spent weeks accepting these weird explanations from Lizzie, who appeared to be living her normal daily life, like on the farm, while her husband's body apparently laid underneath the barn she was working in. And perhaps even more disturbing was the possibility that Daddy Paul wasn't the only victim investigators would find connected to Lizzie. Because once authorities began looking more closely at the Halliday farm, they realized that there were still some people missing. At this point, the Halliday farm had gone from being the site of a suspicious fire to the center of this full-blown, murder investigation now in Sullivan County. And honestly, I don't really think it's possible to overstate just how shocking all of this was, because the people in Sullivan County, like, it's not New York City. It's very rural. It's a big farming community. It's not this like massive city where people just disappear into a crowd. Everyone knew each other. Neighbors recognized the sound of each other's freaking wagons coming down the road. And when investigators uncovered Daddy Paul Halliday's body, the entire county was forced to like grapple pretty much with the reality that something horrible had been happening at the Halliday farm. And that's when the fire, like, they're like, wait a minute, this fire happened a few weeks ago. Now Paul is dead, and Lizzie's giving these stupid explanations to different people. So it's kind of like a wake up realization. But investigators in that moment couldn't shake the feeling that they were done yet. There were still questions surrounding the disappearance of two local women, Margaret McQuillan and her daughter Sarah. According to various accounts from the Times, Margaret had worked for Lizzie at some point, helping around like the house and the farm and with the animals. Now, whether she was hired specifically as a housekeeper or simply like assisting with, duties wasn't really clear. But what is clear is that Margaret and her daughter Sarah had been in close contact with Lizzie shortly before they vanished. And unlike Paul's disappearance, where Lizzie had managed to like explain why he was gone for a period of time, Margaret and Sarah had people actively looking for them this entire time. They just didn't know where they went. Now, Margaret McQuillan wasn't just another like name buried in a newspaper article. She was a mom. She was a single mom trying to make a living during a time where opportunities were super limited for women. Life for working class women in the late 19th century was difficult in ways that are, it's very hard for us to imagine today, kind of thing. Employment options were super scarce, wages were low, and there was a little safety net available, like if something went wrong. Women would often take whatever work they could find to support themselves and their families. They would do domestic labor, things like laundry, housekeeping, caregiving, like these type of jobs that were like daily exhaustion and exhausting, very unappreciated, and necessary for survival. Margaret was doing what other women had done before and done before them. She was trying to provide. And then there was Sarah, Margaret's daughter. Sarah was only 18 years old at the time. She was starting her adulthood and helping her mom work. She had this whole life out in front of her. She wasn't just like a teenage victim in this Lizzie Halliday case. She was a daughter. She was a young woman. She had hopes, dreams, blah, blah, blah. So as concern grew about Margaret and Sarah, investigators returned their attention to the Halliday property once again. They had already discovered one body hidden beneath the barn and then the fire with John. And there was other evidence suggesting that Lizzie had repeatedly lied about Paul's whereabouts. So at one point, investigators started looking at everything kind of differently. Now they're going to start looking at every fresh patch of grass on the farm, every strange explanation, every inconsistency that, could have been insignificant before, but now could be something completely different because they know what they're kind of like looking for. And eventually, their search led them to another discovery. Unfortunately, the bodies of Margaret and Sarah were found buried in a shallow grave on the Halliday property. Newspaper accounts described devastating injury to both of the women. Investigators believed they had died after sustaining severe blunt force trauma. Sound familiar? Their injuries suggested repeated blows delivered with really heavy force. Some reports speculated that tools commonly found on the farm could have been used in the attacks. Others were less specific, but everyone did agree upon that these had been really terrible killings. And it's impossible to not kind of think, did Sarah and Margaret die together? Did they know they were in danger? Did one of them witness the other one getting killed? Like, were they attacked unexpectedly, or did they see this coming? Was it Lizzie? Unfortunately, these are questions that what we see, because it's so long ago, history really can't answer. The evidence available at the time just simply wasn't sophisticated enough to reconstruct every detail of what happened like we can today in court cases. Modern forensic investigators might have been able to like establish timelines or, analyze the blood spatter, recover DNA evidence, and paint this picture of what happened. But in 1891, investigators were obviously working with far fewer resources. So, as the news of the discovery spread, the public's reaction was very intense. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, and they heavily focused on Sarah. And I want to think that they focused on Sarah because of her age. Like, she still was a child. So readers who may have initially viewed the Halliday case as just like another murder investigation suddenly found themselves like confronted with the death of an 18-year-old and her mom and the husband and then potentially the mentally challenged son as well. So it just adds this layer of horror to what is already a disturbing story. Like, it caused, which I can only imagine because it would do the same today, it caused the Halliday farm to become the source of like fascination. If this shit happened right now and we were hearing about it, people would be flocking. So curious people, as you can imagine, traveled to the area hoping to catch some glimpse of the Halliday property or potentially Lizzie. Reporters flocked upon Sullivan County. They interviewed neighbors, they interviewed investigators, they pretty much interviewed anyone willing to talk. The public wanted answers, like, who was this Lizzie Halliday? How had she managed to live among all these normal people without raising more alarms? Were there warning signs that people had missed? Were there more victims? And by this point, investigators had uncovered the remains of Daddy Paul beneath the barn floor. They had discovered Margaret and Sarah buried on the property. Questions about John Halliday's death and the house fire still kind of lingered everywhere. And as reporters dug deeper into Lizzie's past, they uncovered stories involving her dead husbands. I think she was on number four or five at this point, and two of them died. Three
Three.
out of five had died.
That is the majority.
Ladies and gentlemen, elementary school kids, that is what we call majority. And, she had these dead husbands. She had also been suspected of poisoning one of her husbands who did not die. She had the business that she got charged and convicted with catching on fire. And she was also known at this point to have at least three other names. That's a little crazy. Okay, Lizzie, calm it down, dude. You're about to be caught. So the more people learned about Lizzie, the more terrifying the picture became because no one, like, they didn't look at this woman who had simply like snapped. To people on the outside, it looks like just this normal human who had casually been leaving a path of destruction, and people just didn't see it all connected. Now, once authorities finally had her in custody, the whole nation pretty much prepared for what was about to be a huge murder trial of the 19th century. Of course, it's not like being videotaped live, so I don't understand. They would have to wait weeks to find out what happened, but it's fine. But before Lizzie Halliday ever stepped foot inside of a courtroom, she began behaving in ways that ultimately left, investigators, doctors, attorneys, journalists, you name it, asking a question that would ultimately determine whether she died in the electric chair or spent the rest of her life inside of a criminal asylum. Was Lizzie one of the most calculated killers America had ever seen? Or was she completely insane? So by the time Lizzie Halliday was taken into custody, people across New York had become absolutely obsessed with this case, which I don't think that's much of an exaggeration. Today we have 24-hour news cycles, true crime document. Every night I watch some type of true crime documentary. That's how I go to bed. Podcasts, YouTube channels, social media. I mean, stuff is constantly being fed to us, competing for attention. But in the late 1800s, a case like this consumed people in a completely different way. Newspapers were the prime source of entertainment and information, and the Halliday case had made everything the public knew everything because it was in their only source of media. There was a woman being accused of multiple murders. There were hidden graves on a rural farm, whispers about dead husbands, suspicious fires, and now they're trying to figure out, like, oh, was this a cold-blooded killer or was she just nuts? So when authorities first arrested Lizzie, she appeared calm. I feel like that's kind of like a weird thing to start with. There wasn't like some dramatic confession. There wasn't like a emotional collapse. Instead, there were moments where Lizzie seemed completely capable of like living a normal life and having normal conversations. But then sometimes without warning, that composure would completely disappear. Jail officials soon found themselves struggling to understand exactly what they were dealing with. Some days Lizzie had reportedly behaved like any other inmate waiting trial. She would answer questions, she would follow instructions. She demonstrated this awareness of what was happening around her. But then there would be other days when witnesses described something completely different. Lizzie would be aggressive, shouting, curse words, profanities at guards and jail staff. She would lash out verbally at anyone who tried to interact with her. And at times, she reportedly appeared like disconnected from reality, making these weird and bizarre statements or behaving in ways that left people like generally confused and questioning if she even was like mentally there. So that's going to be where things start to get complicated because throughout history, yeah, there's been criminals who genuinely suffered from severe mental illnesses. We talk about that a lot on this podcast. And there's also been criminals who understood about appearing mentally ill being able to change the outcome of their case. The problem is that, especially in the 1800s, distinguishing between those two possibilities isn't easy. And I mean, it really isn't easy today sometimes either. It just depends. In this day and age, we know so much about psychology and psychiatry, and we have, competency evaluations, and we have these complex texts.
Yeah, I feel like at the time you'd have to be like so outwardly insane and incapable of acting normal for them to be like, okay, actually insane.
Right. But the thing with her, she kept bouncing back and forth between the two. So, like, is she faking it, or is that like a disassociation kind of thing, or a multiple personality? That didn't exist for a long time.
Good thing we're not a doctor back then.
Thank God. Okay. Psychiatry, having the diagnostic criteria wasn't standardized. Treatments were pretty much ineffective, and like we know with lobotomies, very harmful. The public did not understand mental illnesses, and it was very limited at best. So people began debating whether Lizzie Halliday was truly insane. They were trying to answer a question that, like, even modern experts still try to deal with on a daily basis. All right, while we've got this going on, newspapers are continuing to dig into, like, Lizzie's past. And honestly, the deeper they look, the worse things seem to get, because now the articles are revisiting the suspicious deaths of her former husbands. The stories of the alleged poisoning starts to get resurfaced. The arson conviction in Philly finds its way back into the headlines. Like, people who had known Lizzie for years came forward with their impressions of her. And they weren't good. They weren't good. She was manipulative, quick-tempered, unstable. I think there was like 2 that I saw of people that tried to defend her. But taken together, all of these accounts painted the picture of a woman who had spent years moving from town to town and leaving some kind of turmoil everywhere she went. So as public interest intensified, prosecutors began preparing for trial. Now, their job wasn't necessarily to prove that Lizzie was a bad person. Their job was to prove that she had committed murder. More importantly, she had understood what she was doing when she committed those murders. And from the prosecution's perspective, the evidence told a compelling story. It wasn't, Lizzie had provided conflicting explanations. Investigators believe that these weren't like isolated incidents either, but pretty much Lizzie's way of trying to just eliminate any obstacles in her life and then just conceal what she could. The defense, on the other hand, faced an incredibly difficult challenge because even if they wanted to argue that Lizzie had nothing to do with the murders, the reality was that the evidence tying her to the victims was becoming harder and harder to ignore. So, increasingly attention shifted towards another possibility. What if Lizzie Halliday wasn't legally responsible because she wasn't mentally competent? Was Lizzie manipulative? Yeah, definitely, for sure. But did she understand enough about the legal system to realize that the claims of insanity might benefit her? Also, possibility, yeah. Could she also have been suffering from severe psychiatric issues? Absolutely. And honestly, I think that's why part of this case continues to fascinate people to this day. That's how I found out about it. Even after all these years, historians still debate about what was really happening inside of Lizzie's head. Adding even more complexity to the situation were the reports that Lizzie had attempted to take her own life multiple times while in custody. So, different sources describe the events differently, but not unusual with such an older case. But the fact remains that concerns about Lizzie's mental state grew increasingly difficult to dismiss. Was this just another attempt to manipulate everybody around her? People couldn't really agree on anything. So, as trial preparations continued, the atmosphere surrounding the case became almost impossible to separate from what was going on. Crowds would gather at the courthouses in Sullivan County, hoping to catch a glimpse of Lizzie whenever she was transported between locations. Newspaper illustrations depict her appearance as crazy. Editorials debated whether or not society should even execute women at all. Religious leaders kind of chipped in. Physicians offered their opinions, and ordinary citizens argued every day about it, as they still do. And through it all, three victims remained at the center of this case: Paul Halliday, Margaret McQuillan, and Sarah McQuillan. I mean, the three of them deserve justice, as did her former husbands, if they had been murdered, because we don't know. And so eventually the leading proceedings formally began. Witnesses prepared to testify. Investigators organized evidence collected from the Halliday property. Medical experts stood ready to offer opinions regarding Lizzie's psychological condition. And for the first time since authorities had uncovered the bodies buried on the farm, everyone involved in the case understood that a jury would soon be asked to answer the question that had divided everybody's opinion from the beginning. Was Lizzie a calculating murderer who knew exactly what she was doing? Or was she so mentally ill that she could not have been held fully responsible for her actions? And the answer would not only determine Lizzie's fate, it would determine whether or not she became the first woman in American history to be sentenced to die in the electric chair. And honestly, the trial that followed would prove every bit as dramatic and controversial as people thought it would be. Because okay, here's another side note. Back then, there weren't plea deals, which we love, because I actually really hate plea deals because I want to know. Go through the whole court case, go through the trial. Like, I want to hear all about it. Don't give me a stupid plea deal.
No, it should be a requirement if you get a plea deal. You have to write down
What happened?
like chapters.
I want at least 100 pages.
I want to start from the beginning. What went wrong in your childhood? How did we get here?
What is your mom's maiden name, her social security, and where are the bodies buried?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so witnesses took to the stand and kind of recounted the inconsistent explanations that Lizzie had been providing about Paul's disappearance. People testified about conversations they had had with her, statements that had seemed real at the time but appeared very suspicious after the fact. Investigators described the discoveries made on the Halliday property and the circumstances that had transformed, this once missing persons investigation into this now large multi-murder case of the century. Each piece of testimony added another layer to the prosecution's argument that Lizzie had not only committed the murder, but actively worked to conceal those crimes afterwards, which kind of provides that she's not mentally incapable of knowing what she was doing because she tried to hide everything as well. Now, on the other side, the defense faced an uphill battle because defending Lizzie Halliday meant trying to reconcile two different realities, pretty much. Like one hand, the evidence connecting her to the victims was very difficult to ignore, but on the other hand, there were these huge mounting concerns about her mental state that just you can't brush aside. She had these reports of bizarre behavior while incarcerated and had continued attracting that attention. Stories describing her emotional outbursts, unpredictable conduct, and this instability had been very common here in the courtroom. So the defense leaned into those concerns, suggesting that whatever had happened on the farm, Lizzie might not have possessed the mental capacity to necessarily fully comprehend or understand her actions. And this is where I think I have to remember that the conversation surrounding mental health and mental illness looks very different in the late 19th century. Today, there are legal standards designed to evaluate competency and criminal responsibility. Those standards aren't perfect by any means. Actually, I still think they suck, but at least they exist. In the 1890s, nothing. There was pretty much nothing. Public understanding of psychiatric disorders was very limited. Stigma was out there, and women exhibiting behaviors outside of what was normal was they were often just labeled as hysterical or crazy. So when physicians were asked to evaluate Lizzie, they entered into this like situation that there was a cultural assumption about gender and violence and sanity, and was she just crazy because she was a woman? So some medical experts said that she displayed signs that were consistent with a mental illness, and others suspected that she was exaggerating or manipulating. As the trial progressed, newspapers documented every development with, enthusiasm pretty much. Readers who had followed this case from the beginning were consumed about testimony and witness testimony and, the courtroom exchanges and expert opinions. Could a woman be convicted of such horrible crimes? Should she be executed? These questions went far beyond the Halliday case itself, but she was the one that really brought that conversation into play. Eventually, after hearing the evidence and arguments presented by both sides, the jury reached its decision, and Lizzie Halliday was found guilty of murder. It had been months of investigation, national headlines, buried bodies, all of this stuff, and now finally there was an answer, at least partially, because even though the jury had determined that Lizzie had legal responsibility for the crime she committed, the next question would be what type of punishment should follow. And when that answer was given, it sent shockwaves throughout the entire country because Lizzie was being sentenced to death. And more specifically, she was being sentenced to death by electrocution. So just like that, Lizzie Halliday in the late 1800s secured a place in American history. She became the first woman in the US to ever be condemned to execution via the electric chair. And honestly, people reacted strongly about it. Some celebrated what they viewed as justice, on behalf of Paul, Margaret, and Sarah, and potentially the other past husbands. But others just expressed this discomfort with the idea of executing a woman, regardless of what kind of crimes. The question surrounding Lizzie's insanity had not gone that far. If anything, now it was more intensified. Like, she had been convicted and charged, and they said they were going to execute her. Well, is she mentally insane? Like, that's just the answer wasn't out there yet. So eventually, a panel of physicians were tasked with evaluating Lizzie's mental state. They spent lots of time observing her, interviewing her, and trying to determine whether she understood the nature of her sentence, which I think, obviously, it's a long time ago, but it's definitely backwards. You shouldn't be charged and convicted, and then they do a mental evaluation. Like, because you're going to tell me I'm being charged and convicted of murders and I'm going to die via electric chair, and then you're going to come see if I'm mentally ill? I'm going to act so mentally ill that I'm getting out of my sentence.
Especially when it was raised as a defense.
Right. They're like, we're gonna kill you, but we need to see if you're mentally unstable, because if you're mentally unstable, we'll get you off of the electric chair. I'd be out there, go, she's brain dead.
Suddenly I'm mute.
Eyes are crossed, whatever you need. Ultimately, they did conclude that Lizzie was insane, which obviously changed everything. So instead of being executed, Lizzie's death sentences was effectively put on hold. The woman who had come within reach of becoming the first female victim of the electric chair would actually never make it there. Instead, authorities transferred her to the Matawan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Now, if you haven't heard of Matawan before, because it is famous and it's worth taking a quick look-sees. Matawan wasn't a traditional prison. It wasn't really a regular psychiatric hospital either. It was kind of in between. So this institution had been created specifically for people who had committed crimes but were considered mentally ill. So some patients had been found not guilty by reason of insanities, but others, like Lizzie, had been declared insane post-conviction. The facility housed murderers, violent offenders, and individuals authorities believed posed significant risks to themselves or others and weren't going to be let go into society. There were like these massive walls around the property, and security was extremely tight. Staff members understood that they weren't just caring for ordinary patients, they were overseeing some of the most dangerous people in the state. After all, what more could happen? They're in a mental prison now. Lizzie had already been accused of multiple murders, stood trial, received a death sentence, and now she was going to spend the rest of her life locked away from society. Case closed. Except it wasn't. Because one thing that became clear is when studying Lizzie Halliday is that she just never seemed capable of existing peacefully. Not in marriages, not in communities, not in prisons, and not in a psychiatric institution. Almost from the moment she arrived in Matawan, reports suggested she was a very difficult patient. She argued with staff, she clashed with authority figures, she displayed the same violent tendencies that had followed her throughout much of her adult life. Some people described her once again as unpredictable and hostile. Others suggested she remained deeply suspicious of the people around her and frequently accused staff members and fellow patients of mistreating her. Anyways, years passed. Outside the walls of Matawan, the public's attention moved on. Other stories, other scandals. The Halliday murders became history. Newspapers stopped putting Lizzie's face on them, and for many people, Lizzie disappeared effectively from public's view, and that should have been the end. But despite all of the walls, guards, locked doors, and medical supervision surrounding her, Lizzie continued on her reign of terror. In 1906, nearly 15 years after the Halliday Farm murders, a nurse named Nellie Wicks would encounter Lizzie inside of Matawan. February 28, 1906, Nurse Nellie was attacked while performing her ordinary responsibilities while working inside of the facility. According to some reports from the time, Lizzie somehow gained possession of a pair of scissors. It wasn't entirely clear from the records, but then without warning, Lizzie launched an attack on Nellie. It was apparent suddenly, a burst of violence, and within a few seconds, Lizzie repeatedly stabbed Nurse Nellie, inflicting multiple wounds before staff members were able to intervene. Nellie had been horribly injured, and despite efforts to save her in the moment, Nellie did pass from the wounds. And just like that, more than a decade after the farm murders, Lizzie Halliday had another victim. The killing generated renewed interest in Lizzie's story. Newspapers once again revisited the Halliday murders, but unlike the other murders, there was not going to be any dramatic trial following Nellie's death. There was no courtroom battle or anything. Lizzie was already in the exact place where authorities thought she should belong, in the hospital, so she remained there. In the end, Lizzie Halliday died quietly inside of the walls of the Matawan State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. She never faced the punishment the court had originally handed down, that of the electric chair, and we probably won't ever really know how many deaths she was actually responsible for. But what we do know is that a lot of lives were changed for the worse because of her. And that is the story of Lizzie Halliday.
She was iconic. Golly.
Iconic. I mean, a queen of murders.
it's impossible to tell if she was actually insane or not. My first instinct is that she was just in it for the love of the game. Like she did not give a fuck.
No, I don't think she did. I really don't think she was I don't think she was mentally insane.
No, because what she did to planning and covering up things up in line, if you just snapped and killed someone, that's different than planning out five, six murders.
Right. And following through with all of it, she also buried all the bodies and stuff like that. Like I don't think she knew consequences because she would peace out every time. She would do something bad and then peace out. So obviously, like, let's just say nowadays she wouldn't have been criminally insane. All right, you want to jump over into overtime?
Let's do it.
So, ladies, gentlemen, dogs and cats, we have something to tell you guys. I hope you've stayed on for this part because it is very important. This will be brief. We are not going to do a long overtime today because we have something to tell you. In order to prepare for next week's episode, you have a mission. You have homework. Next week's episode, we're super stoked to like announce it. It's going to be a really cool thing for us to do. But our good friends at a podcast that we have kind of been promoting for a little bit. We know these girls. They're from Forensic Fridays. We met them at CrimeCon last year in Denver, and we love them. We're obsessed with them. They are in the psychology, psychiatric, mental health awareness fields on their end. And we are going to be doing a joint podcast. They're going to be some guest speakers for our account, and we're going over the Taylor Parker case. Now, if you don't know the Taylor Parker case, this is what we need you to do. In order to prepare for next week's episode being dropped, you, listeners, need to go and read up on the Taylor Parker case. If you want to do that, we will be posting links to two separate documentaries if you don't want to just do free research on your own. But one that I highly recommend watching is on Netflix. I actually had multiple people reach out to me as soon as this one dropped a few days ago because, good God, you need to go watch it. Trigger warnings. Watch it, listen to it, research the Taylor Parker case. The documentary I'm talking about is on Netflix. It's called Maternal Instinct. We just want you guys to prepare for the next episode because we are not going to be doing a recap of the story. We are simply going to just dive deep in, go ahead and do a deep dive, whatever, into Taylor Parker's story. And so with Forensic Fridays. So we're not telling a normal story. There's no script. There's no one person talking. It's going to be five true crime loving girls, females, going over this case. It's absolutely nuts. And yeah, that's what I've got.
I will say, for anyone who doesn't know the case, hasn't watched the doc, it's insane.
Crazy.
Insane. It's all everyone's talking about. My boyfriend, who notoriously hates true crime content, could not get enough of the doc and was asking a bajillion
Really?
questions. Oh, yeah.
Dang. I will say, now that you say that, my mom was here and we watched it together. Cameron sat for the first half of it, which like Cameron also does not watch or listen to any true crime things. I don't know how we got partners that are like, you know what? And Luke isn't either, Holly's husband. So we all got partners that just don't like this shit. Maternal Instinct on Netflix is nuts. Taylor Parker, fucking nuts. So we're super stoked to be doing this special guest episode next week with Forensic Fridays. It's gonna be awesome, but you guys have to do your research ahead of time. Otherwise, you're gonna be confused.
We'll break it down.
We'll do a little recap and then we're gonna really get into it. All right, you guys. Well, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Over My Dead Pod. If you want even more information about this case, check us out on our website at overmydeadpod.com. You can always look at us on social media. Don't look at us on social media. That's weird. You can always look us up on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the above. And we will see you guys next week for a very special episode. Bye.
Bye.